We'll be starting our next panel, and I know that this has been a lot of information, but hopefully you've gotten to verify and validate some of your family's experiences and also gotten to learn a little bit more. We're going to be going to the Homefront now, and we're going to be starting off with Monty Hom giving us a quick little conversation about the USOs here in Chinatown.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, my goodness, it's like we've been blowing through this so quickly. Oh my gosh. I'm really excited to be part of this next panel because I really got to know a lot of the women of World War II while doing my film. And I think it was really, really special to hear the stories from the ones that served in uniform and as well as served the Chinese community on the home front. When we say home front, I think everyone understands that not everyone was in uniform, but they also did work in the war industry. For example, the shipyards across the bay, the shipyards down here in San Francisco, Naval Air Station, Alameda. Some also went to work at other states in the war factory plants, for example, aircraft factories down in Southern California. But also a lot of women here volunteered for the Red Cross. They were folding bandages, making sweaters, caps for the soldiers abroad on both theaters, Pacific and the European Theater of Operations. What we're going to start with today is, let me go to my next slide. This picture here is a very rare picture. It's one of the few surviving pictures that showed the original Chinese canteen for servicemen, which was started really in the pre-war era in the 1930s. But there wasn't really a name yet back then, but they were actually saving all of the contributions from the Chinese community for the Rice Bowl drives to send the money back to China for the volunteer fighter pilots, for example. By 1941, because the draft started in 1940, all the Chinese Americans that were in service, and there were quite a lot of them drafted from our districts. Actually, the first 40 names in the October 1940 draft, there was 7 Chinese Americans already on that 40 person list. And those were the ones that came into uniform very early on in 1940. So the canteen was created to give a place for Chinese servicemen to go to because we were not welcomed at the USO downtown on Market. Can you believe that? So if you were in uniform, you were Chinese, you had nowhere to go. So this is why the Chinese canteen was established. This is Mary Wong, whom I got to know. She's also in my film. Very special lady. She's the taller lady on the right, and she's also the lady on the left right here, dancing with the very tall Caucasian soldier. Okay, so her and several friends got together and decided that they needed to form this organization because there was no place for the Chinese American servicemen. So they actually had 2 locations. They actually had an East Bay location, but this San Francisco location was the largest, and it was at the CHSA location as it is today at the Y, basically on Clay Street. So when they started this, it was all because they really needed a place for these boys to go to. And they said they always had a good time, whatever that meant. So here are the girls at the original location. Mary's in the center. She was the director. And she basically brought in a lot of funding from the community. They also had some external funding eventually that came from the USO and other organizations. So Chinese American servicemen actually had a great time here. And I was told that probably more than 10 or up to 20% met their future husbands here. So I guess they were having fun, right? So this is a rare shot of them at dance at the hall. And, you know, it was great memories, everyone said. But this is the first time that we're actually having this opportunity to really understand what the community was involved in, especially a Chinese canteen USO. So this is the first time we're seeing these pictures too. Luckily, Mary had given me her album, so I have all of the original photographs and some of the memorabilia that was saved from the Chinatown USO. And it was the only one in America if you can believe that. Only one. So how about we do a dance in here? What do you guys think? I think it would be nice, right? Yeah, come on. We'll do swing and everything. Come back in costume. Come on, that'll be nice. So we're going to now get into women in uniform. Hazel Ying Lee is very important. Chinese American woman from the Pacific Northwest, Oregon. She was our first Chinese American pilot that flew for the Women's Air Force Service pilots. But before that, as you can see her, she was already an aviator in the mid-1930s. And I was told from her sister that she flew better than most men, okay? And the men were like, wow, where'd this girl come from? Now, just so you know how serious she was, she booked her own voyage and went back to China, talked to the Chinese Air Force and said, hey, I'm here, I'm a flyer, give me a job. And the Chinese Air Force said, nope, we don't take women. And she was a better flyer than most of those Chinese flyers. So she was actually heartbroken, and she came out to the States eventually. And of course, there was no jobs for Chinese American women in aviation. So she was floundering until in 1942, late 1942, there was a call for women with civilian pilot's license. And Hazel was one of the early ones that obviously volunteered and was accepted. And the sad part of this story is that Hazel was tragically killed in November of 1944. So she flew for almost a year and a half, flew a lot of missions, and what they did was they ferried aircraft from the plants to the point of embarkation at the airfields around the country. So if you can imagine, a lot of these planes weren't tested. So you're flying at your own risk. If something happens, you go down. That's it. But the way that Hazel unfortunately lost her life was there was a cross landing. Communications was bad. Her radio had issues, and another plane landed on top of her. So yes, so she is our sort of trailblazer that really opened the way for Chinese American women, which our second person, which is Margaret G. And we have Tiffany Miller, who's going to talk about Maggie in just a second. We have a very close connection with Maggie together because we share some very intimate stories and a relationship with her in her past decades. And Tiffany's going to fill us all in. But I wanted to start with this picture, and the reason why is you see here this bust. This bust is under my care right now, and it was donated because basically it was a project done on veterans, 200 faces in the United States, and she was chosen to represent Chinese American women. And so we're going to probably find a permanent home for that bust one of these days, and you're seeing it for the first time. And Maggie is here. We have photographs. And her original yearbook is shown here for the first time. And her wings, made by Jostens, was issued to her in 44. And then I am showing for the first time her original flying helmet and her goggles and her scarf. So that's, you guys could take a look at that later. But I'm going to, Tiffany, I'm going to introduce you first, if that's okay. Because we're going to go right into Maggie, and then we're going to go right into Ann Lee, and right into Connie, okay? Okay. Tiffany, all yours.
Thank you, Monty. So as Monty mentioned, my name's Tiffany Miller, and I'm very honored to be included in the panel here today. You may be able to tell that I'm not Chinese American, unfortunately, for me. But I do have a very close connection to the WASP because my grandmother, Elaine Danforth Harmon, was one of the Women's Air Force Service pilots. And she and Maggie G trained together in the same class. And after their graduation from the WASP, they were stationed together in Las Vegas until the WASP were disbanded close to the end of the war. So because of that, they remained very close, lifelong friends. And although my family was from Maryland and Maggie was from over here in the East Bay, the distance didn't separate them because they were bound together by this experience that they had in World War II. So as Monty mentioned, the Women's Air Force Service Pilots, or the WASP, were a very special group of women that flew in World War II. They were the first American women to fly for the U.S. military, and they were put together as the brainchild of two well-known female pilots, Nancy Harkness Love and Jacqueline Cochran. And their idea was, because in World War II it was an all-hands-on-deck situation, they needed every resources, our country needed every single resource we could possibly utilize, and there was a strong need for male pilots to be available overseas for combat missions. And so Jacqueline Cochran and Nancy Harkness Love had this idea to create a women's division of pilots within the U.S. Air Force, or the Army Air Force at that time, and to have them fly domestic missions to free up male pilots for overseas duties. And so they were able to convince the U.S. government to take a chance on this program. They were not officially militarized. They were told that if they proved themselves to be worthy pilots, that they would eventually be officially militarized. So they were considered basically like civilian contractors. But despite that, they followed military discipline, they wore uniforms, they had ranks, and they completed the exact same training programs that the male pilots completed. And 25,000 women applied to this program, and only ultimately about 1,100 of them were able to pass. There were only 2 Chinese American women that were accepted into this program, which Monty mentioned. The first was Hazel Ying Lee, who tragically lost her life. There were 38 women throughout the WASP program's existence that lost their life in the line of duty, and Hazel was the last of them. And so unfortunately, Maggie never had the opportunity to meet her, but I'm sure that she was an inspiration to Maggie. So Maggie grew up, she was born in Berkeley and grew up over there with her family. And she became inspired to fly because as a child, her family would spend the weekends at Oakland Airport watching planes take off. And she swears that as a child, she once saw Amelia Earhart at the airport, which is completely plausible. And so she's like, oh, look, I can do this. Women do this. Women fly planes. I'm gonna do this one day. And luckily, her mother was very supportive. And when the U.S. entered World War II, Maggie was actually a freshman at UC Berkeley, and she left her schooling to assist in the war effort. She initially became a draftsman on Mare Island for the U.S. Navy. And she worked saving up all her money as fast as she could so that she could fly with a group of she convinced a group of girlfriends who were working with her on Mare Island to buy an old junky car, and they drove inland to Minden, Nevada, because at that time during the war, private flying was prohibited on the west coast of the U.S., so they had to drive inland to take flying lessons. So they drove over to Minden, Nevada, took their flying lessons, and they all applied to the WASP program, but Maggie was the only one that was accepted. So unfortunately, her girlfriends had to drive back home, but Maggie went on to Texas to the WASP training program. And like I mentioned, there were many, many women who tried out for the program, who entered the program, and only about half of those who entered ultimately graduated, and Maggie was one of those few women. So she, continued within the WASP program, flying planes, flying missions out of Las Vegas, where she was stationed. My understanding is that her primary responsibility was doing tow target practice, which, if you can imagine, these very brave women flew their planes up and they would drag a target behind them, and they would allow the men, the soldiers, to fire live ammunition at their plane for practice. As you can imagine, this was a very dangerous job and definitely not something that I'd think I would volunteer for, but way to go, Maggie. And she also had the opportunity while she was in Nevada to co-pilot a B-17, which was one of the larger airplanes in the U.S. Army's arsenal at that time. Very impressive. So she continued on in the program until the WASP were disbanded unceremoniously close to the end of World War II. Basically what happened is the head of the Army Air Force, Hap Arnold, was very convinced that the WASP program was working well. The women actually had a better flying record than the male pilots. They flew every single type of military aircraft, and they flew millions of miles on their missions. They flew every single type of mission other than combat. So as Monty mentioned, they would test fly aircraft that had been repaired. They would ferry aircraft from the factories to points of embarkation overseas. They would teach the male pilots how to fly. They would do the tow target practice. They did everything that the men did except for combat, which they were prohibited from doing. And because they had such a good service record, the head of the Army Air Force, Hap Arnold, went to Congress and lobbied to get them into the fold and make them officially militarized and make them a permanent part of the U.S. military's Air Force program at that time. And unfortunately for the women, at that time in 1944, the tide of the war had turned, and the U.S. Was feeling pretty confident that we were going to be successful. And there were more men that were returning from overseas, and they saw these women pilots as a threat. And so because of that, they had some very fierce opponents that were lobbying very hard against militarizing and making permanent the WASP program. And unfortunately, those voices were successful, and the WASP were disbanded. Because they were not ever officially militarized, once they were disbanded, they basically just received a cable saying, you're no longer a WASP, the WASP no longer exists, go home. They didn't even get train fare or anything or bus fare to go home. They had to figure out how to get themselves home from wherever they were stationed. And they were told that they should not discuss their service. And their records were sealed, and the program was basically forgotten. So later on in the, decades passed, and these women just had kept their stories to themselves. And then in the 1970s, the U.S. Air Force Academy started accepting women into their program. And because the WASP had been kept such under wraps and forgotten, even the U.S. military at that time, the folks that were in charge, were not aware that this program had existed. And so they started sending out press releases and putting out stories about how amazing it is that women are finally going to fly airplanes for the U.S. military. And so you can imagine Maggie G and my grandmother and the other WASP did not appreciate that too much. So they started to finally organize themselves and say, enough is enough. We've been sitting on this information for 30 years now, and we think that we should be able to talk about this. And so they banded together and started lobbying Congress for some veterans' rights, because they had put their lives on the line, just like the male pilots, just like other service members, and they felt like they should be recognized as such. And they were successful. President Carter signed a bill into law in the 1970s, giving the WASP certain veterans recognition under the Veterans Administration. So for example, my grandmother, who lived in Maryland almost her whole life, was able to get all of her care through the VA, which was wonderful. And there were some other rights as well that they were able to get. They continued organizing and getting together, and Maggie was definitely part of that. And then in 2009, President Obama signed a law recognizing the women Air Force service pilots with the Congressional Gold Medal. And so Maggie was able to come back in 2010 for the ceremony and receive her Congressional Gold Medal, which was really amazing. And here's a picture of her at that ceremony, which was pretty great. And so some of you may be aware, recently Chinese Americans who participated in World War II were also awarded or granted congressional medals, and I think that the ceremony for that is still being organized, but it's still official that they're working, I think, on finalizing the design and everything, and it's great. So I think Maggie G is going to be sort of a double recipient of that. So yeah. She unfortunately passed away a few years ago, and then my grandmother passed a few years after that. In early 2015, my grandmother passed away, and it was my grandmother's last wish to be laid to rest in Arlington National Cemetery. And my family thought this is going to be no issue. My grandmother had been to funerals for other WASP at Arlington, but when my mother applied, the request was denied, and we were very confused. And so my mom had to do a Freedom of Information Act request, and she found out that a few months before my grandmother passed away, the Secretary of the Army at that time had issued a memo which basically said that the WASP were not real veterans, and so they couldn't be in Arlington. And so my family was not too happy about that, as you can imagine, especially considering all the work that Maggie G and my grandmother and other WASP had done to secure veterans recognition for themselves. And we knew that this was something that was very important to my grandmother. It was her last wish. She wrote it out on WASP letterhead, and it was very important to her. And so we organized together as a family, and I ended up posting a petition on change.org, which ultimately gathered over 175,000 signatures. And it got the recognition of the press, which then got the recognition of Congress. And we were able to get the interest of a congresswoman from Arizona, who is now a senator, Martha McSally. And she happens to be the first female fighter pilot to go into combat for the U.S. And because there are still so few women military pilots to this day, when she was in the military, she had a number of WASP who were mentors to her. And so it became a very personal issue for her to make sure that these women got the recognition that they deserved and that they had parity in terms of being able to be in Arlington just like male soldiers. And so she wrote a law. My family worked on helping to lobby for that law, and it was passed in 2016, signed into law by President Obama, and we were able to have the funeral for my grandmother. So as I was working on this lobbying campaign for my grandmother, my sisters peer pressured me into getting Twitter, and I started doing a lot of research about women in the military, women pilots, and I came to realize, or I found out that there is an airport in Istanbul, Turkey, named after Turkey's first female military pilot. And I mentioned this to my husband, and he says, you know, doesn't that tell you a lot? You know, the U.S. thinks it's so progressive, and yet I bet you can't tell me a single airport named after a woman. And I was like, oh my God, he's totally right. And I think that this is something that in our culture just becomes so normalized that we don't even think about it consciously. We see so many statues of men and buildings named after men and other things, all men and white people. And, you know, it just doesn't even sink into our subconscious. We just think, well, women have been held back and people of color have been held back. And so, you know, we're getting there, but it's slow. But when you go back and you really look at the history and you think about what someone like Maggie G or my grandmother contributed, and you think especially about Maggie G and what she had to overcome just to be able to do what she did in her lifetime, it's incredible and definitely something that I think is worthy of recognition. And so I have undertaken a campaign to get Oakland Airport renamed after Maggie G. So I've spoken with the board of the Port of Oakland. I've spoken with the executive director of the airport. I will tell you it's going to be a big uphill battle, but I think that it is something that is worthwhile. I know that my grandmother did an interview many years ago, and she said that the worst thing of all was being forgotten. And when we had this whole drama over the funeral for my grandmother, it really sunk in that now my grandmother is gone. She's not going to be here to go talk at schools or events or send letters to kids that write to her and say, I learned about you in school today. She's not there to return that letter. And so we need to make sure that the next generation knows about what these brave women did and why it's important to our country's history. So that's why I'm working on this, and I'm so pleased to be here with you all today. So I'm going to hand it back to Monty for the next speaker.
Awesome. Great. I just wanted to close this about Maggie. You know, when I first met Maggie in the, I want to say it was 1995, and I was just, out of school, and I heard about her through someone who recommended me to talk to her from CACA, that she was a pilot in World War II. So I think someone found her address and phone number for me, and I called her. And she said, oh, just come by and see me. She's kind of really nonchalant. So I go up to the house, and she has this little cute cottage in Berkeley. She opens the door, and out comes this woman, and she's actually quite attractive. And I thought, I said, excuse me, I'm here to see Maggie G. And then she goes, I am Maggie G. I'll never forget that. And she's absolutely a beautiful soul. And you know, as Tiffany said too, we really know her intimately. We know her very well. And when I went to do my film, We Serve with Pride, where she's featured for the first time in history, all she could say to me was, you know, Monty, I'm not sure I want to do this because I'm kind of older and all that. I said, oh, you look fantastic. Really, you look marvelous. And she just looks at me again. She goes, all right, just make me look good, okay? And then she said, okay. So she had a really great sense of humor, and we really missed her. So I really hope that, Tiffany, that this mission to rename the Oakland Airport, at least to some degree, some high degree, will definitely happen. Thank you, Tiffany, so much. Okay. Okay, so we're going to move on a little bit right before our next guest will be Miss Ann Lee, which I'll introduce. Okay. Hometown girl, grew up right around the corner here. Jessie M. Lee was a longtime volunteer of CHSA until most recently. She's one of the few Chinese American WACs from San Francisco. She went into uniform in late 1943. She comes from a family of, I believe, 4 girls, no boys. And her dad was a little bit depressed because he had no sons to put into the military. So she decided to go downtown and volunteer and enlist, and she got accepted. And when she came home, she told her father was like, oh, you enlisted, huh? Was kind of stoic about it. And she was like, yeah, Dad, aren't you happy? And she was like, oh, yeah. But then later on Jessie found out when walking through Chinatown, everyone said, oh, you're in the Army now. You're in the Army now. You're in the Army. The dad went out and told everybody. And he was so proud of her. So proud that I have the article here that Herb Cain wrote a story of her dad, Mr. Bo T. Lee, was so proud that the daughter went into the service because he had no sons. So she said that from that day on, I guess everybody in Chinatown knew that I was in the service. So Jessie goes on to serve with the U.S. Army Air Force, and she was sent down to Florida with the 3rd Air Force, and she became a teletypist. She did notations for the high-ranking generals, and she was essentially in kind of, you could say, like a clerical office role, but she had to deliver these reports every week to high-ranking officers. Her job was so important that she was also recognized when the Korean War happened in 1951. Guess what? They called her back to active duty in the Air Force. So I don't know of very many Chinese American women that served both in World War II and Korea, but Jessie was a hometown girl that grew up on Clay Street, right around the corner here, and yeah, you know, that's one of the very few Chinese American women that were in uniform, and we have very few that actually served, especially from the Bay Area or San Francisco. Okay, so my next guest, Miss Ann Lee, has a very special, unique story. I think it's a really special story in a sense because we never hear about the Chinese that came to America as part of the Lend-Lease exchange program. And there were a number of Chinese pilots that were sent here to train with the U.S. Army Air Force. And principally, they went to Thunderbird Field in Arizona. Part of this I know is because I have the yearbooks, Ann, and I didn't tell you this, is one of my relatives was Fred Tom. He was one of the male instructors, civilian pilots brought in to train with these men. And there were 5 or 6 civilian Chinese guys that had pilot's license. And one of my relatives was one of these guys. He wasn't in the Air Force, wasn't in the military. He was a commercial pilot, but they were brought in because they also spoke Cantonese and they could fly. So Ann, I'm gonna turn it over to you, okay?
Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you, Monty, for introduction, and feel honored to be here and introduce this story, huh? So, as mentioned in this morning, and in 1930, start in 1931, then 1937, and China encountered a Japanese invader, and Japanese has a heavy bomb in China homeland, and then the Chinese Air Force is very few. Compared with Japanese, say there's 1,000 of the airplane, in China at that time only has about 100, but these 100 is not all can be used in the battlefield. So lots of civilian and the people and died during the war. So clearly Shenat and invited by the Madame Sung and joined China. They become a very good relationship with the couple of the Chiang Kai-shek at that time. So, but Chinese Air Force at that time, even it's very weak. And a lot of very good family, young people, they just give up what they already have in the family. They joined the Chinese Air Force fighting with Japanese, start from 1937, August. And in a couple of years after that, lots of people died, and the airplane almost gone. So they cannot compete with Japanese Air Force. So after that, and before the Pearl Harbor accident, and Shenad introduced the AVG, so give China and a kind of boost and help a lot fighting with the Japanese. So in this case, and the Kunming and the Sichuan, the air raid, as compared with before, is getting much lesser. But at the meantime, and according to Shenad, and working with President Roosevelt, and try to get more Chinese Air Force to be trained in U.S. This is my uncle, and Jia He Li. He is a very smart student in Beijing University and physical department. Actually, some of his classmates now is a Nobel Prize winner, Yang Zhengying, but my uncle at that time just want to save the country and give up his study and join the Chinese army to be trained in U.S. So they taking the ship SS Asano to go through the over the hump, then go through Mumbai, then all the Indian Ocean, then the Atlantic, and arrived in New York, taking more than 30 days, and then taking trains to Arizona, and to be trained in Arizona several airfield. So this is the picture I got the Life magazines, and these young men and trained in Arizona. Because there are English limitation, so they got lots of interpreter and lots of instruction, and have to be interpreted by the people help, and also the language writing either in English or the Chinese. This means hydro aerodynamic class or something like that. And this, you can see, this is it's kind of elite Chinese young men, and picked from all the province of China, from the university or military college. They are trained in US. I read some historical document from the archive of Thunderbird airfield. And this is written by the America. They just say, compare with Chinese air cadet and other 26 different countries cadet, and the Chinese cadet is the most diligent and well-disciplined and behave very good and learn very fast. The only backward is their language. So you can see this is the Chinese Air Force trend in Luke. And the first one, and he died in the battle after he back to China. So this is all the Chinese. So before I continue, Actually, I just bring a story about I just recently happened and found. Maybe before I forgot to introduce myself, too excited. I grew up in Shanghai, and came to Canada as an international student 30 years ago. So I got my second master degree, computer science, in University of Victoria, then working as an IT professional in Canada for almost 20 years, then moved to Silicon Valley because this is the base of the IT industry. But just from beginning of last year, so I stepped into the journey as a writer and a historian. This is all because of the story of my uncle and all this Chinese Air Force. Since I started to involve this, thanks Chuck and Doris, and introduced me to the 14th Air Force and all the veterans here. So I got to know lots of people. And also I got introduced with Vic Lin. And his father, Alan Lin, actually is American Chinese, born in America. Then during the World War II, just voluntarily want to join the Air Force and to help with the war. He is the only one of Chinese. At that time, even he learned aviation, but he's not allowed to be an officer of Air Force. Then he put in the application form as a Caucasian. At that time, there's no such thing like a picture or whatever like now. And so they just adopt him. And he become an officer. Actually, you know, the whole story, thanks Brenda as well, and introduced me to know the Victor Lin. He is one of the Air Force officer, instructor in that airfield in the Arizona, training my uncle and all these Chinese. And the long story is Victor Lin's family, also Arthur Lin. He's the first couple of the Chinese aviator and went to China to help China build the Chinese aircraft. This is a very, very touching story about his family life. And also he showed me the yearbook. Oh, this is his father's picture as a Chinese American Air Force in Arizona training Chinese Air Force. This is the picture. I have a lot of pictures from him. This is the yearbook about, at that time, it's a 43C. That means 43 C class. And these are all Chinese Air Force student pictures and listed in this yearbook. I got from the Victor Lin. It's very precious. Thanks, he gave me this stuff. So these students are working very diligently with the U.S. instructor. But flying is not so easy as we saw our airplane fly in the sky. And sometimes if you are not pay attention or weather or different kind of reason, it could be crash. This is very, very, one of the picture which I received by one of the, this is one class, first one class, 50 people arrived to the US. These are very high, well-trained officer, Air Force officer in China and sent to US. You can see the white cross on their head, all died either in battle or accident. And the red is afterward, they came back to China or Taiwan, their illness died. Among these, only one still alive I think this one, and living in Hong Kong, over 100 years old. So I saw the picture about him recently. So you can see, even in training, and the causality is very high. So my uncle is one of it, and during training, died in U.S. So this is, I don't know who, this is not my uncle, but one of it. They buried 52 people buried in the Fort Bliss National Cemetery in El Paso, Texas. This is the gate of the Fort Bliss National Cemetery. But, you know, after, if people not dying during the training, they sent back to China to join the CACW, Composite Wing, to fight together with U.S. Air Force fight Japanese. This is, it's another story, very sad. This is my uncle's accident report. So after my uncle died, then, you know, after the Japanese war, anti-Japanese war finished in 1945, August, and then become the Civil War. Then Chiang Kai-shek's government and to Taiwan, and then communist government start in 1949. So the world totally changed. I never see my uncle. I only saw one of the picture, my uncle, and my father told me. Actually, my father at that time working for U.S. Air Force in Ujaba in Kunming to help with the interpreter, as an interpreter. So only say, oh, your uncle died in U.S. and because the air flight training. But this is kind of a story, it's have to be hidden. We cannot say anything publicly. And during the Cultural Revolution, my grandpa, because hide some of my uncle's death report and some the uniform, some stuff, then found by Red Guard. Then my grandpa is beaten and criticized. So the same day, my grandpa hanged himself and suicide because my uncle is Chinese Air Force. You know, so for us, we don't want to remember the hatred, just want to working together to keep the world at peace. I don't want to claim the politics. It's more, you know, for the harmony of the world. History already passed, but we cannot forget this. You know, all what I have to do is for my uncle and my grandpa and my father. So we don't know after 70 years where my uncle buried in US. So until after me and my brother went to abroad, study in abroad and working in US, finally we found the place where he buried in Texas. So my family hurry go to the cemetery to pay tribute. This is the plan, my uncle, it's a B-25. Actually, if you see that picture, there's a total 9 people in that plan. And October 1st, 1944, in just a training. And then 3 Chinese Air Force, 6 American Air Force. In the evening, they just want to fly for the training. So finally, the crash to the hill, only 1 survived, and it's heavily, you know, injured, but all the others died. I read the report after this page. It's a long report. So just say once only 2 people try to rescue them, and they can hear several people yelling for help, but the burning too heavy. So the only one survived. He's sitting in here, in this place, but in the front, or can even hear they yelling for help, but they cannot be rescued. The fire is too big. So this is the picture from the accident report. It's a crash site. So once I know my uncle's buried place, so our family and Harry, this is one of the cousins from the Los Angeles, drive almost 2,000 miles from LA to El Paso to pay tribute of my uncle. So this is another cousin from Beijing, and fly over to the place. She doesn't know English well. She after the airport drop off, and he just went to take the taxi, go to the cemetery, and cannot find the place by have a sell the flower. He just had to put his scarf and put in front of it because he cannot leave it without anything, right? So this is my brother, maybe 4 years ago went there. He put 2 flower and the America flag to try to remember my uncle. This is last year, me and my husband went there. So after that, my friend found, my brother, after see my uncle, then he found in this cemetery, how comes all this headstone curved with Chinese Air Force? And then no flower, no one, because no one knows they are buried there. For my family, we came to America, we found it. So that's the reason I quit my job, and we just say, I go to China and try to find a family. So now in this cemetery, 52, another cemetery in Georgia, Atlanta, 5 people buried there. So now we working with the volunteer, and in China and Taiwan, we already found 28 family. And in May, we bring the family to the cemetery to pay tribute. And I have some videos on YouTube, maybe you can later. So this is my last page. Death is not true departure, but forgetting is. The Chinese Air Force buried in America will continue existing in our loving memory. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ann Lee. That was awesome. A great story. Just another page of history that is a bit unknown, right? About this cooperation of China, Chinese Americans, and Chinese Americans in World War II. There's a tie-in I want to mention too with Connie, because she's actually a Southern California girl. Connie is also my mentor, a longtime friend, and her father, mother, actually her mother and other relatives hosted some of these Chinese pilots that came because they visited Los Angeles. So you'll see this. And Connie has a really, really unique story to tell. Her father is a big powerhouse, especially as a Chinese American veteran, and definitely his story deserves to be told. The reason why also the memorial at St. Mary's Square Park exists is because of him. So I want to introduce Connie Young Yu.
Thank you so much, Monty. This is a great help. I'm so inspired to be here. Thank you for speaking, Tiffany, and loved your talk, and Anne, which I will refer to a lot of things you've said, and Monty and also General Chen for setting the whole stage for this program, which gives us so much of the broad picture of World War II. So I'm just going to begin with some background on my father, because I'm going to be talking about his diary, and to reveal what he was like as a person, and what his character was like, and all the influences of his life, okay? So the first slide is of my grandfather, whom I knew very well, and my grandmother. This is Mr. and Mrs. Yongsong Wong, last name first. And the first son is George Ming Young, born in 1910. And this is my father, John C. Young. And the year is 1913. My father's born in 1912. And this is a great celebratory moment. This is a photograph of a family celebrating the success of the revolution, because my grandfather was a leader of the Sun Yat-sen's Revolutionary Party in San Jose. So it meant a great deal to him. Well, first of all, he cut his cue off very early. He came at the age of 11 to San Jose. And the first Chinatown that he was in was burned to the ground by arson. So he was very familiar with the anti-Chinese movement. But he loved San Jose, loved California. He stayed, a new Chinatown was built, and that's where my father and uncle are born. Next slide. So this is Grant School, and I think this is 5th grade. There's my dad sitting in front. There's his friend Art Ng. There are 2 Japanese girls, Elsie and Anna, I believe. And there are many Italian and Portuguese immigrants in this school. And this school was very close to what is now Japantown. And when they were rating the schools, you know, in the district, they were saying, oh, the school where a lot of the immigrants are is not the best academic school. Well, actually, it was a wonderful school, because my father said the teachers inspired him that you can be anything. My uncle decided he was going to be a pilot, and he's not in this picture because he's a year and a half older. And my father wanted to be an engineer. And the person that inspired them most of all was Sing Kei. Sing Kei was born in Saratoga, and after he was wounded in France, after he rescued a French unit, an American unit, after his wonderful bravery and being decorated by General Pershing. And actually, Sing Kei had to recover in a hospital because he was overcome by mustard gas. But he returned to a full hero's welcome in San Jose. And my father and his friends remembered what it was like seeing this World War I hero come into the Chinatown where they had built a stage. And he stood up and greeted everybody, and people were so moved. And also one of his other comrades, Ju Tong, came. And both these World War I soldiers were standing there, very brave, and they were given lycée by the town elders, But they remembered the feeling of patriotism. So they felt very, very American, very, very patriotic, and my father always felt he had a destiny to follow this, the role model of Sing Kei. So. And then here's my father and Uncle Ming, and here's my grandfather. See, he was grandfather and grandmother. My grandfather was a laborer. He came as the 11-year-old laborer, worked really hard, worked in the strawberry fields, made bricks. He worked, when the Chinatown was burned, he came to San Francisco, worked in Chinatown, as a custodian in a hotel. And he saved up enough money and this is very difficult, to go to China to get married, because his mother said, you have to come back to get married, because you're not going to find a wife in America. Well, that's not exactly true, but anyway, he got married to my grandmother, but he was not able to bring her over. He was not able to bring her over for 14 years. They were separated for 14 years. And so by the time she got over here, she was in her 30s, and people said, you're not going to have a family. But she ended up with these wonderful boys, very proud. And she's wearing this jade heart, And my grandfather at this time was a merchant. He had owned a store in Chinatown. So he was able to bring her over because he changed his status from laborer to merchant. And the reason why he was able to go to China, he had a re-entry permit because he came 1 year before the exclusion law. So there are all these. So anyway, my grandmother's wearing a jade heart that I have now. So Ming becomes a pilot, and he couldn't get into he was the first Chinese American to get a pilot's transport license, but he couldn't get into the Army Air Force because they didn't take Chinese. So he, being very patriotic to China as well, because his father was always supporting China, modernization of China, and democracy for China. So he inspired Ming to go overseas. Ming becomes a pilot, and at the age of 27, he becomes a colonel. And in a reconnaissance mission 30 miles outside of Canton, he was killed in a plane crash. So my father was at Stanford, a graduate student in engineering at the time. He took ROTC, which was probably one of the best courses he ever took, because he became a first lieutenant, commissioned officer. And you know, in those days, they called the Chinese men boys. They're always boys. Actually, most people were called boys. It's just, anyway, so Chinese boy. They don't say Chinese American boy. He was born in, you know. So Stanford, this is June, 2 months after my uncle was killed. My grandmother looks like she's aged like 20 years, and she always had her hair very carefully combed, but you can see that she's looking very, very distraught. And my grandfather's looking very solemn. It should be a very happy, celebratory moment. Their son getting an engineer's degree, the only Chinese in his class. So he's getting a graduate degree in engineering. And it should be a great moment of pride. And you can see that there's a lot of grief there. But they are very determined. And my father wasn't totally miserable because he was engaged. And he was engaged to Mary Lee of San Francisco. And she's a granddaughter of a pioneer, Li Wong, a railroad worker, a foreman on the Central Pacific. That's where I get a lot of my stories. So, and they are engaged, and she also felt this intense sadness at that moment, and she told me about it, that she just tried to cheer him up, but he was already determined to do something. He knew that he would have to take on the mantle of his brother. So here it is 2 weeks after Pearl Harbor. There I am, I'm a baby. That's my sister, and that's my mother and father. And my father he's a very positive person. You know, when I was born, my grandparents who lived with us, my grandfather was completely disappointed. He goes, another girl. Oh my God, who's going to carry on the name, you know? And but after a while, I kind of won him over. But and my mother said to me, and she told me when I was a baby, "You're going to have to do something. You're going to have to prove yourself," you know. So my father, of course, you know, he really wanted to go. He really wanted to go. He was prepared. He was in the Army Reserves, and he knew he'd be called up. And being the only surviving son, he could have applied to stay stateside, but he did not. He said, I wanted to go. So he was sent overseas as a combat ordnance officer to CBI. So I couldn't even walk at that time, and my father wrote a letter saying to my mother, I guess I won't be around to see Connie learn how to walk. So this is a picture my father sent from, I guess, India. He's still first lieutenant, okay, CBI. And then I have to say, on the ship was when he first started writing in his diary. He also wrote my mother a letter saying, I'm doing fine, you know, doing great, and don't worry about me. He always said that, every single letter, don't worry, I'm doing great. And let's see, in his diary, he writes every single day of what the ship voyage was like. And also, on the ship, he had to take Mandarin classes because he's Cantonese, and they were going to send him to China. They said, just in case, you better have Mandarin. And then they all learned how to sing the World War II anthem of China, which is Qi Lai. And Qi Lai, rising up, that is the theme of our exhibit, Call to Rise. And there I am. This is a picture my mother sent to my dad because I learned how to sing Qi Lai, not very well, but I learned how to sing high, you know, victory. So there's my mom patiently, and she sent my father like cards and a few letters, and she had to write regularly because he said, please write, you know, please write, I want to know everything, okay? And there, now this is interesting because, see in the background, there's this, I guess a little banner, it has fringe on it. There's a V for victory. And every household that had a man serving overseas was given one of these. That meant, you know, this is the home that is, you know, guarding the home front, but they have somebody overseas. You can't imagine them doing that now, hanging up signs saying, there's no man in the house, you know. So, yeah, yeah. So this is mail call somewhere in China, Captains Barn and Young. That's one of my dad's buddies. He's actually a financial officer. See, these were citizen soldiers. They had jobs before, you know, and my father Ordnance, but he had to report, you know, send requisitions to Barnes whenever he needed anything. And I know this because my father was starting to keep a diary, very, very intricate diary, very, very detailed. Okay, right? Okay. Okay. This is one of the early. No, it's not that early, but yes, it's quite detailed. Now, my father was considered he said, I was considered an old man at 30. I mean, there were guys, I mean, he was an officer, he's a lieutenant, but there were lieutenants that were like 20 years old. So, but he was, you know, he was given a lot of responsibility, I guess, because he ended up being he's an ordnance officer, but his first assignment was provost marshal, which is security of the base of Ramgarh. And he said, I guess that he details what it was like being in India. Now, I hope there's time for this, but he said, this is the early entry. There are 2 divisions of Chinese troops here, plus headquarter unit and motor transport unit, totaling about 30,000 troops. In May 1942, 38 division, that's the number of the division, with 5,800. 20, and then division number 22 with 2,700. The rest of the 30,000 were flown in from China by plane without a single casualty. The British officers have their wives and families with them. And I thought, what? And you realize, because India was a colony of England. So the Chinese troops consisted of military soldiers from various provinces, a great many of them from China, Yunnan province, many from Guangzhou, and my father knew how to write he actually knew how to write Chinese because he went to Chinese school in San Jose. He was a good student. And he said, met Major Hu of the 22nd Division, who said most of the soldiers of this division died from starvation during their retreat from Burma. Starvation, malaria, dysentery, and other diseases have taken more lives than the guns of the Japs. And, you know, and my father really, I think he felt this is history. This is so important. He had to write it down for himself as well as posterity. But I think it was just to understand this for himself. Now, he told me later, he goes, you're not supposed to keep a diary. You're not supposed to take pictures. Well, but those rules were violated. Okay, are we winding up? Okay, I better just show my slides. I'll just show my slides. Okay, just go. And here's the way the diaries look, you know, and they got shorter, the entries got shorter and shorter. And all that he wrote in the letters were, Dear Mary, I'm doing fine, dear darling, you know, kiss the girls for me, tell them I'll give them a puppy when I come home, which then never happened, you know, so, yeah. And then this was a very dramatic one where he saw for the first time a plane being shot down. He said there were 8 Japanese planes bombing the Air Force base, and one was shot down that he saw. And then he said they didn't lose any American planes, but several Japanese planes were shot. But he saw it fall into the jungle, and he joins the search party and finds the bodies of the Japanese and brings back the intel, the maps, and all the other apparatus. And that was part of the mission. Okay. And then here's the ordnance maintenance team. So he goes from India, he sent finally to do his ordnance work. This is the ordnance maintenance team. Kunming, China. The first row is Chinese Americans, and they have interpreters. My father had an interpreter because they're all Cantonese. And then these are all Mandarin, and these are Chinese nationals, and the back are GIs, American GIs, proudly with their CBI insignia. Okay. And then, meanwhile, my mother's at home with, and she decides to accompany her mother from San Francisco, who wants to go to Columbus, Ohio, to say goodbye to her sons, her two sons. That's Lai Lee, and that's Fred Lee. And both of them could not ride the same plane together because they were brothers. And this was after the seven Sullivan brothers were killed in one ship. So they decided separate, like Saving Private Ryan, separate brothers. So anyway, this is in Columbus, Ohio, and it goes, okay, and here's the picture of my mother with the cadets that were training, and they were just finished training. They were going to go overseas. They were visiting Los Angeles. They were visiting Whittier, and they were from the Thunderbird Air Force Base at Thunderbird Field. And my mother, with her beautiful Chinese dress, she took them out to dinner, treated them. She sends this picture to my dad. He was furious. He said, "Don't ever send me pictures of you with other men. I just want to see pictures of the kids." So here are my grandparents who loved the cadets because it reminded them of their son. And there I am. See, we're getting older, That's my sister, and these are my cousins. They all wear uniforms. And in the background are all the Chinese cadets. And the tall one's name is Mr. Wong, cadet. I knew Wong like in bright. Okay, one more. Yeah, I'm almost done. Okay, there we are. More cadet pictures my dad didn't want to see. Okay, and there it shows you how tall he was. He's from Shandong province. Yeah. Okay, next. And then these are letters, we'll just keep going. Yeah. Okay, another letter just came back. That other letter say, I just came back from seeing 2 good movies, one with Humphrey Bogart, To Have and To Have Not, So he wrote, and then finally, the last, he comes home. And he came home on rotation. Somebody spoke before about rotation. My father was overseas for 31 months. So they said he did not know the war was going to be over. He thought this was going to be a short visit. But there I am. We're very happy. My mother was thrilled. And then a couple months later, VJ Day. And everybody said, your father was so lucky to come back. Everybody else was waiting for transport to come home. And there's my father with the CBI. And he was awarded the medal from the Cloud and Banner Medal from the National Chinese government for his service to China. And then the last picture. Okay, that's all right. Well, that's the end of the slide. Oh, there. Okay, well, this is already 1951. Tomorrow you're going to go to the rededication. So my father spearheaded the drive for the monument to the fallen World War I, World War II soldiers and airmen and servicemen who gave the ultimate sacrifice. And so there's my dad, there's General Whittemire, who is his commander-in-chief, head of CBI after Stilwell. So this was a great moment. He felt, you can see the look on his face, that this was the destiny and it would continue. So thank you.
So thank you, everyone. We're going to give you a moment to stretch your legs while we pick up for the next panel and our last panel of the day. But before you get up, I do want to make a note that we are going to be distributing those program feedback forms. So please fill them out if you can. It'll only take a couple of minutes. It's really absolutely necessary for us. And if you parked at Golden Gate and want your park and ride stamp, please come and do it at this time. Thank you.